Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another video in my history series, where today I'm going to be sharing the story of Henrietta Lacks. She can be credited with changing the face of modern medicine. She's often actually referred to as the mother of modern medicine. Her cancer cells have been used in medical experiments for decades around the world and have been used to study the human genome, to understand how viruses work and spread, to test the effects of radiation, and even played a crucial role in the development of the polio vaccine, leading to potentially millions of people being saved a terrible fate. Except Henrietta Lacks never even knew any of this. She never gave consent for her cells to be cultivated and used in this way. It was decades until her family found out her legacy. This case raised some very important questions about the ethics in healthcare, privacy, and the rights of patients. But first, I want to take a moment to share with you Murder by the Sea, a true crime documentary series that airs on CBS Reality. New episodes of Murder by the Sea follow a new host, crime historian and author Dr. Nell Darby, as she takes a look at the dark side of the coastlines and seaside towns of the UK, which have a reputation for attracting an extraordinarily high number of murderers and crimes, including Bournemouth, Newport, Dundee and Jersey. Murder by the Sea airs on CBS Reality on Tuesdays at 10 PM from the 8th September. You can watch CBS Reality on Sky, Freeview, Virgin and Freesat. So Henrietta Lacks was born as Loretta Pleasant in Roanoke, Virginia, USA on the 1st of August 1920 to Eliza Lacks Pleasant and Johnny Pleasant. At some point she started to be known as Henrietta. Whether she or her family changed it, no one really knows, but she was known as Henny to those close to her. She was born in a small shack on a road overlooking a train depot. Each day hundreds of freight trains would thunder past. There was no peace and quiet. It was the same shack floor where multiple members of her family had also been born. She was the 9th out of 10 children. Eliza ended up dying whilst giving birth to her 10th child when Henrietta was just 4 years old. Despite having 10 children, Johnny Pleasant wasn't winning any Best Father awards. He hobbled around on a cane that he was known to hit people with. He didn't have the patience to raise children, and so once his wife died, he upped his family and took them to Clover, Virginia, where his family still lived and farmed the tobacco fields, the very same tobacco fields on which their ancestors had worked as slaves. The plantation had once been owned by Henrietta's white great-grandfather and great-uncle, and had remained in the family after slavery had been abolished. Upon arrival in Clover, the 10 children were split up and given to different family members, as nobody had the means to care for all 10 of them. Henrietta ended up going with her grandfather, Tommy Lacks. Tommy lived in the house home, a 4-room wooden cabin that was once the slave quarters of the plantation. It had no electricity or water, it was lit by gas lanterns, was said to be constantly cold, and water would have to be brought up the hill from the creek, which was Henrietta's job growing up. Out the back there was a cemetery which held numerous family members. Henrietta wasn't the only child being raised by her grandfather. He was also looking after David Lacks, another grandchild that a different daughter had left behind. He was Henrietta's cousin. David was known as Day to everyone because of the country accent of the area. So Day was 5 years older than Henrietta, 9 years old to her 4, and they shared a room. They would end up spending the rest of their lives together, eventually getting married. Most members of the Lack family in Clover would start working on the tobacco farm from a very early age, rarely finishing school before starting work. Day left school in the 4th grade because he was needed to help in the fields, but Henrietta managed to stay until the 6th grade. She was a hard worker throughout her life. She didn't really have much choice. She would wake early to feed the livestock each morning before walking 2 miles to the coloured school, which was a 3-room wooden farmhouse. To get there, she'd have to walk past the white school where the children would throw rocks at her. This was in the midst of segregation, and Henrietta was under no illusions. Her life was always more difficult than her white counterparts, even from a young age. But for the most part, she had a happy childhood, playing with her cousins and siblings in the field, hanging ropes off big trees and watching the stars until Grandpa Tommy would force them to go to bed. But Henrietta's childhood would come to an abrupt end when she fell pregnant by Day at just the age of 13. She gave birth to her first son Lawrence at 14 years old, and 4 years later gave birth to her daughter Elsie. Elsie was often referred to back in her time as different or simple. She couldn't speak or play like the other children, but now we can look back and say she had developmental delays, likely due to epilepsy or neurosyphilis. But despite the difficulties, Henrietta did everything she could to raise Elsie to her best potential. 2 years later, Day and Henrietta would marry on the 10th of April 1941 in Halifax County, Virginia. She was 20 and he was 25. The very next day they were back to work in tobacco fields. There was no allowance for time off or a honeymoon. They barely sold enough tobacco throughout each season to feed the family, which is why when a few months later Day got a job working in a shipyard at a small black community outside Baltimore, Maryland called Turner Station, he took it and moved away whilst Henrietta stayed to take care of the children. It was a while before Day had made enough money for a house and tickets for Henrietta and their 2 children at the time to come and join them. She was just 21 years old when she moved to Turner Station. Once their new life had started in Maryland, they had 3 more children: David, who was known as Sonny, Deborah and Joseph. Once their new life started in Maryland, they had 3 more children: David, who was known as Sonny, Deborah and Joseph. Joseph was born in 1950, but Henrietta had started to notice something was up before she fell pregnant with him. She spoke to 2 of her cousins, Margaret and Sadie, about how she felt a knot down there in her vagina. She told them, "It hurts something awful when that man went to get with me. Sweet Jesus, aren't them some pains?" But her cousin suggested that she probably felt strange because she was pregnant. Lo and behold, a few weeks later she discovered she was indeed pregnant and put the strange feeling out of her mind for a while, although she wasn't convinced that was the reason. It was also around this same time that Henrietta really started to struggle to take care of Elsie. She was getting older and harder to control, especially with the pregnancy. Doctors advised Henrietta that it was best to send Elsie to Crownsville State Hospital, which was then known as the Hospital for the Negro Insane, for institutionalisation. Cousins said that part of Henrietta died the day she sent Elsie away, and she would visit her once a week religiously until she sadly died. Once Joseph was born, Henrietta noticed that the knot hadn't gone away and there was a significant amount of blood in her urine. She did a self-examination and found that she could definitely feel something in her vagina, so tells her husband that she needs to go to the doctor. The local doctor does a syphilis test, which came back as negative, and told Henrietta that she better go to the gynecology clinic at Johns Hopkins, which she did on the 29th of January 1951. It was the only hospital in the area that treated black patients, although it was still segregated. White-only hospitals would send away black people even if they were on the verge of death. It was rare to find a hospital that would treat black patients even if it was still segregated. But Johns Hopkins still treating black patients didn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that they received the same level of care as the white patients. I mean, this is still something that's seen today in modern medicine. African Americans have the highest mortality rate for all cancers compared with any other racial or ethnic group. There's 11 out of 1,000 infant deaths amongst black Americans, which is almost twice the national average of 5.8 infant deaths. Even down to insurance, in 2017 only 89.4% of African Americans had healthcare coverage in the USA, compared with 93.7% of white Americans. These kind of disparities run really deep. This kind of bias is ingrained in modern medicine from its creation. If you want a deeper look into this, I would highly recommend my video on the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, during which syphilis was left untreated in black men for decades to see how it affected the body. These men were never told they had syphilis, they were just told they had some bad blood. I'm sure some of you are going to be rolling your eyes, George is talking about race again, but as I always like to remind my viewers, it would be a disservice to skirt around these issues when they're relevant. So much of history is steeped in racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, just all the injustice, and we can't make the world better by ignoring these issues. They need to be addressed and understood, which is why I find it important to address and understand them. So when something like this is relevant in a video, I'm going to mention it. You can't change history, but you can try and make the future better for everyone, and this case isn't, excuse the pun, black and white. It's actually incredibly nuanced, as you'll see before we go through this video, but it's important to mention these things. It just gives more context. Henrietta's doctor at Johns Hopkins was Howard W. Jones, who took a look and immediately saw the mass on Henrietta's cervix in exactly the place she had described. Jones was a seasoned gynecologist. Cervical tumours were not new to him, but he said that he'd never seen anything like Henrietta's tumour, which he described as shiny and purple, not unlike grape jello. It was so delicate that it bled at the slightest touch. He cut a small sample and sent it to the pathology lab for testing and sent Henrietta home to await her diagnosis. What's interesting is that Henrietta had given birth at this same hospital just mere months earlier. She had felt the knot even before this pregnancy began. No one noted there being any cervical abnormalities at that point or when she made her routine checkup visit 6 weeks later. Had this tumour grown to this size within just a few months, or had simply no one picked up on it and no one paid any attention? Less than a week later, she got her diagnosis: stage 1 epidermoid carcinoma of the cervix, cervical cancer. There are two types of cervical cancer: invasive carcinomas that have penetrated the surface of the cervix, and non-invasive carcinomas known as carcinoma in situ. They grow in a smooth layer across the surface but don't generally invade. It was believed back in the 50s that invasive carcinomas were the deadly ones, in situ were not. Henrietta's was invasive, although now we know of course that any cancer can be deadly. On the 6th of February 1951, Henrietta Lacks goes back to Johns Hopkins for the beginning of her treatment. She signs a consent form to give the Johns Hopkins Hospital consent to perform any operative procedures under any anaesthetic that they may deem necessary for her proper surgical care and treatment. That's it, she signed this consent form for her care and treatment, which they did do with radium, as was the norm at the time. I mean, I suppose radiation, chemotherapy, is still used now to treat cancer, but it was a little bit different back then. Henrietta was treated with a tube of radium slipped inside her cervix and sewed in place. Then a pouch filled with radium was sewed to the outer surface of her cervix, and then another packed against it. Several rolls of gauze were packed inside her vagina to keep all of this in place. And then a catheter was put in. But before all of this was done, the surgeon, Dr. Lawrence Wharton Jr., did something that would change the face of medicine forever. He dilated her cervix and shaved off 2 dime-sized pieces of tissue, one from a tumour and one from the healthy cervical tissue. Dr. Richard Tlind was the head of gynecology at Hopkins and one of the head cervical cancer experts in the USA, and he'd recently been exploring a theory of his, that carcinoma in situ was an early stage of invasive carcinoma, that the two were connected, which wasn't a common thought at the time. He wanted to compare tissue from carcinomas in situ, invasive carcinomas and healthy cervical tissue to test this idea. So he contacted George Guy, the head of tissue culture research at Hopkins. Guy had a similar interest. Him and his wife had spent 3 decades trying to grow malignant cancer cells outside of the body, hoping that he could be the one to find the cure for cancer. But the problem was that most human cells died quickly once outside the body, and not much could be done for them. Nobody expected any different when Henrietta's cells were sent to Guy without her consent or even knowledge. In fact, they collected cervical cancer cells from pretty much every woman who walked into Hopkins with the diagnosis. So whilst Henrietta was sent off to recover, the samples were sent off to Guy's lab, where they were received by a 21-year-old lab assistant called Mary Kubasek. Mary sterilised and then got to work, slicing the sample into 1mm squares, which were then sucked into pipettes and dropped into test tubes that had chicken blood clots in them. She wrote HeLa on the side, a shortened form of Henrietta Lacks, and then put the sealed tubes into an incubator. To this day, the name HeLa is infamous in the scientific and medical communities. They are the most commonly used cells in research today. But back in the very early days of HeLa cells, Mary would check the cells in the incubator, noticing that something was indeed happening. There were little rings of white forming around the clots. But she didn't let herself get too excited because the cells always died eventually. They'd never found any cells that lived outside the human body. But Henrietta's would never die. In fact, they were growing at an incredibly fast rate, soon doubling every 24 hours. Soon there would be millions of them, far too many for George Guy to use in his own research. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. Henrietta's cells seemed to thrive. So when some of Guy's colleagues asked if they could have some to use in their own research, he said yes. In fact, he said yes to anybody who wanted them for cancer research. Soon, Henrietta's cells were being used around the world once Guy realised they were even hardy enough to endure the US Postal Service. He could pop them in the post and they'd arrive at a different lab perfectly healthy. They're still being used worldwide today as part of the HeLa Immortal cell line. Her cell line never dies, it just keeps multiplying. But whilst Henrietta's cells proved to be immortal, she sadly did not. On the 8th of August 1951, she goes back to Johns Hopkins for a routine treatment session and never leaves again, after asking to be admitted due to severe abdominal pain. Although she received blood transfusions, she died on the 4th of October 1951, aged just 31. Her autopsy report shows that the cancer had metastasised throughout her entire body. The official cause of death was noted as terminal uremia, blood poisoning from the build-up of toxins normally flushed out of the body in urine. Her entire body had been taken over by tumours. She had one completely blocking her urethra, leaving her unable to pee even with a catheter put in. The incredibly fast reproducing cells that would prove invaluable to medical research were the very thing that killed her. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the family cemetery outside the house in Clover. She didn't even have a headstone until 2010 when one was donated to the family. For the Lax family, the loss of Henrietta at such a young age was devastating. She was a beloved mother and wife, the very centre of the family. But on the very same day as her death, George Guy goes up in front of TV cameras, holds up a tube of HeLa cells and announces that a new age of medical research has begun, one that could find the cure for cancer. But of course, no one knew that the cells belonged to Henrietta Lacks. It's estimated that today the total weight of all the HeLa cells ever grown exceeds 50 million metric tons. That's a lot of cells. Most cells grow in a single layer in a clot on a glass surface, which mean that eventually they're going to run out of space. Scientists had to constantly keep an eye on cell growth, scrape cells from one tube and put them into another to allow continued growth. It was very hard work. But HeLa cells don't care. They will grow on top of each other, on any surface, in any temperature, in suspension. They're just not picky. Once people realised how amazing these cells were, multiplying at an incredibly fast rate and incredibly hardy, demand for them rose. The cells were put into mass production and a special unit was established in none other than the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama to aid this mass production, the HeLa Distribution Center. The very same Tuskegee Institute that at the very same time was running the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. I really can't urge you enough to go and watch that video I made, it's relevant as hell. Tuskegee at the time was actually one of the most prestigious black universities in the country, and this is where the whole ethics behind this thing gets a bit complicated, as things always are. By putting the distribution centre at Tuskegee, it would provide hundreds of thousands of dollars in funding and many jobs and training opportunities for young black scientists in the area who maybe otherwise wouldn't have had this opportunity. There's a quote from the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Scoots which sums this up better than I could. She writes, "Black scientists and technicians, many of them women, use cells from a black woman to help save the lives of millions of Americans, most of them white. And they did so on the same campus and at the very same time that state officials were conducting the infamous Tuskegee syphilis studies." Like I said, it's nuanced. From there, HeLa cells would be unstoppable. They were being produced at a remarkable rate. They would prove to be vital for the development of the polio vaccine, which the world had been working on for years to this point to no avail. They had been trying to test their vaccines on cells from monkeys, which were incredibly expensive and worth it if it worked, but it didn't, of course. And they were spending millions on these failed experiments. But then along came HeLa cells, which had this incredible ability to grow. If HeLa cells turned out to be susceptible to the polio virus, which not all cells are, then this would be the perfect solution. They could test potential vaccines for cheap, minus the animal testing, which, whilst not an issue back then, I'm sure modern audiences would be pleased to know. And of course, Henrietta's magical cells turned out to be more susceptible to poliovirus than any other cells had ever seen. Soon, Dr. Jonas Salk was able to test his polio vaccine, found it worked, and is able to be rolled out for public use, saving potentially millions worldwide. Polio is a disease that for decades the medical field believed, though, to only affect white people, believing black people to be immune. There was very little reason to think this, it was just what they thought. But it was later concluded that whilst incidence of polio in black people was lower than amongst white, the fatalities that would occur because of it were higher amongst black people, most likely due to a lack of medical facilities catered to them and a general lower quality of care. So when a polio vaccine was created using the cells from a black woman without her or her family's consent or any compensation provided, and it went on to be used for majority white people, you can see the ethical questions there. But of course, it's not inherently bad that a vaccine for polio was found. That is a good thing. Over the years, HeLa cells have been used for some huge breakthroughs in biomedical research. They are used to study the effects of radiation, toxins. We have a much higher understanding of cancer due to our understanding of HeLa cells. Telomerase, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, is an enzyme that helps cancer cells evade destruction by quickly repairing their DNA. That was first discovered in HeLa cells. It helped us discover that HPV, the human papillomavirus, can cause cervical cancer, and a vaccine was created. My school year was the first in the UK to receive this vaccine. I think I was in year 8 at the time. That's because of HeLa cells. They've been used to study measles, mumps, HIV and Ebola. It's been used to help with IVF research. It's because of HeLa that we know that human cells have 46 chromosomes, because a scientist working with HeLa discovered a chemical that makes chromosomes visible. And it was through this that it was discovered that HeLa cells have around 80 highly mutated chromosomes, which is probably why they mutate so quickly. HeLa cells have even been to outer space. There is no denying that the human understanding of biomedical science has been boosted hugely because of HeLa. Millions of lives have been helped and saved because of them and because of Henrietta Lacks. Even today, HeLa cells are being used in an attempt to develop a vaccine for COVID-19. All of this because of one woman and her tumour. And Dr. Guy never made any money from these cells. He let anyone who wanted them for research take them free of charge. But now they're commercialised, they're bought and sold every single day worldwide and have generated millions in profits. Huge amounts of money, huge industries. But the Lacks family never saw a penny of it. They were a poor, poor family, living in poverty, working in tobacco fields, barely able to scrape together enough money to keep life going. The Lacks family had little education because they had to work. They had no health insurance and many members of the family had serious illnesses themselves. No one ever told them anything. They didn't know anything of HeLa cells until more than 20 years after Henrietta's death in 1973. And even when they did find out, it was purely by accident. It got to a point where most people using the HeLa cells in their everyday research didn't even know what HeLa stood for. The whispers were that they belonged to a Helen Lane or a Helen Larson. Most people didn't know the name Henrietta Lacks, yet they were playing with her cells every single day. One scientist discovered that many cell cultures thought to be from other tissue types were in fact HeLa cells. It turned out that HeLa cells could literally float on dust particles in the air and contaminate other cultures. And because of this, there was a lot of contamination that they'd never realised. In order to sort out this contamination problem, a group of scientists tracked down Henrietta's living relatives to take DNA samples to use them to make a map of Henrietta's genes and tell apart the HeLa cells from other cell cultures that they got all mixed in with. So one day, a doctor called Day Lacks, who, if you remember, left school in the 4th grade. Day had basically no understanding of what a cell even was, but it was through this one phone call that he found out that HeLa cells existed. Actually, his understanding of the phone call was that Henrietta herself was still alive and they'd been researching on her for over 2 decades, but that obviously isn't what the doctor said. But this doctor, the scientist that called up Day Lacks, didn't realise that the Lacks family had no idea about HeLa cells. From that moment on, the whole lives of the Lacks family became about understanding HeLa cells and what that meant for them. They felt proud at first that their mother's cells had saved lives, but what were the consequences of that? They really struggled to understand and to bridge the gap between themselves and the scientists because nobody seemed to speak in a language that they understood. Scientists and medical professionals were speaking to them in medical language that they just didn't know. Every time they tried to get an explanation, it just seemed to confuse things more. What were HeLa cells? But their big question was, if their mother was so important to medicine, if their mother had made so much money, why could they not afford health insurance themselves? Didn't they deserve some form of compensation, something for their mother's contribution to science? I'm sure if Henrietta, when she was alive, had been told that if they took her cells they could change the course of modern medicine, she would have consented without a second thought. I mean, wouldn't you? A small biopsy to save millions. It's an absolutely incredible legacy to have, and at the time the researchers didn't think they were doing anything wrong by taking Henrietta's cells. In the 1950s there was no established practice of seeking permission to take tissue for scientific research purposes. And Johns Hopkins themselves, who took the cells, never patented HeLa cells, nor did they ever sell them commercially. So did they owe anything to the family? This is an ethical question with so many layers. It's not two-dimensional. The problem comes when it did get commercialised, when it was used worldwide for so many things and the Lacks family was still kept in the dark. I mean, they were still struggling when this money, or even the notoriety itself, could have changed their lives for the better. I mean, one of Henrietta's kids was living homeless on the streets of Baltimore. The scientists' decision to take Henrietta's cells was not an inherently racist one. It was the norm at the time at Johns Hopkins to take cervical cancer samples from white and black patients, all of them. But Henrietta was a black woman, a descendant of slaves working in the very same tobacco fields, living in abject poverty. The money from the commercialisation of HeLa cells could have changed their lives entirely, but to this day they're still fighting against the cause. And they couldn't argue at first or do anything about it because of that education gap that may have been caused by the colour of their skin. There are so many layers to this. It could even just come down to a lack of simple courtesy between the scientific community and the Lacks family. I would love to hear your thoughts about this in the comments down below. I mean, when George Guy discovered that Henrietta's cells were multiplying at a really fast rate and he thought this could do amazing things for science, should he have just picked up the phone and called Day Lacks and be like, by the way, this could be something important? But seeing as there was no set precedence to do anything like this in the USA at the time, it's not surprising that he didn't do this. It was Henrietta's daughter, Deborah Lacks-Pullum, who was determined to get a better view of what was going on. She was only a baby when her mother died. She never knew her and was desperate to know what she was like. She had questions about pieces of her mother still being alive around the world, like, can she even rest in peace if you're shooting bits of her off to the moon, because Henrietta did go to space, or her cells did. Questions that any family member would have, but of course the scientists that were dealing with them had no idea how to answer those questions. To them, Henrietta Lacks wasn't a woman, a mother, a wife, but a bunch of cells. Deborah has said, "We never knew they took her cells and people done got filthy rich, but we don't get a dime." For a long time, the family couldn't even afford a lawyer to take their case, and Johns Hopkins Hospital were no help, mainly because, as they rightly said, they never commercialised HeLa themselves and they never did anything illegal. But then in the 1980s, family medical records were published without their consent in conjunction with HeLa research. Is that okay, even for the advancement of science? There have also been many questions over ownership of cells and tissues. Time and time again, courts have ruled that a person's discarded cells and tissues are not their property and therefore can be commercialised. But does the person the tissue belongs to deserve a say about what happens to it and how it can be used? Do they deserve a share of any profits that result from this tissue? You'd think that the answer would obviously be yes. Of course, a person deserves a say in how their tissue, essentially a part of them, their DNA, is used. But almost every single time this argument comes up, every time somebody is sued, the courts side with the scientists. We're in a time when personalised medicine is becoming the norm. Doctors and scientists can tailor treatments to people's genetics, get them the best possible treatment for their exact illness. It's a huge step forward in science. So many lives can be saved with this kind of work. But for this to happen, researchers have to have access to a large amount of genetic data from a wide variety of different samples. Samples that may have been taken without the donor's permission from decades ago or from months ago. In March 2013, researchers published a DNA sequence of the genome of a strain of HeLa cells, which of course raised questions within the Lacks family about their own genetic information being available for public access. Henrietta's DNA is their DNA after all. There's a lot of questions and concerns over people's DNA at the moment. You've probably heard of it being brought up in response to ancestry testing kits and the like, but the law hasn't quite caught up with this modern technology yet. There's no legalities around it at all. That very same year, another group working on a different HeLa cell line's genome with funding from the National Institutes of Health submitted their work for publication. An agreement was eventually reached between the Lacks family and the National Institutes of Health that gave the family some control over access to the cell's DNA sequence found in these two studies, along with promise of acknowledgement in scientific papers. They also agreed that 2 family members would join the 6-member committee that grants permission to access HeLa sequence information. I told you this case was going to be a minefield of ethical questions, not only about the treatment of Henrietta and her cells, but bioethical questions about the wider use of tissue and cells and DNA information. Nowadays, you'll probably be asked to sign a consent form whenever your tissue is taken for something like this. The common rule was established in 1981, enforcing informed consent by ensuring that doctors inform patients if they plan to use any details of the patient's case in research and give them the choice of disclosing their details or not. That's only from 1981. But would you really understand the further implications of this if your doctor just presents you with a form about using your DNA in research and you sign it? Do you understand what's going to happen there? If your cells are found to be just as magical and invaluable as Henrietta's were, would you have any rights to them at all? There's no denying that Henrietta Lacks transformed the face of modern medicine. She just didn't know it. Even if she had lived, would she have known it? Probably not. But HeLa cells are one of the most important things that have happened in medicine in the last 100 years. I can't wait to see all of your thoughts and feelings about this one in the comments down below. It's just an absolute minefield with so many questions to be asked and answered. And I think it's a lot of questions that even the highest up people don't really know the answer to yet. Just the law hasn't quite caught up to all this. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you know of any similar cases that you'd like me to cover, then please, once again, let me know in the comments and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.